Thanks, Andrea. And I just want to echo Sarah's comments about thanking our hosts for putting on this conference. We're all kind of blown away by how amazing it is. So I feel like I'm a greeter at the Gap with this thing on. I should be trying to sell you a T-shirt or something. So my background is I started as a writer, actually, covering arts and culture and interviewing celebrities for newspapers in Canada. But in 2001, I took a job as a correspondent for Reuters based in Kinshasa. For the first 2 years, I was based in Congo and Rwanda, covering this huge, sprawling conflict that involved 9 countries in Central Africa. But the week that I decided to go there was the week of 9/11. And I initially thought, as a young journalist, younger than I am now, 30 at the time, I thought maybe I should go to this big story if I want to carve out a career for myself as a foreign correspondent. That's where all the stories are going to be. That's where all the media focus is going to be for the next decade. But then I thought, similar to what Sarah was saying about, look where other people aren't looking. And I thought, there's this massive story happening in Central Africa. There aren't many journalists there. There was a BBC correspondent and an AP correspondent and myself. And so for the first while, is this on? I guess not. Here we go. When I started out, it was about living an adventurous lifestyle, doing exciting things, making friends along the way, this kind of stuff. And for 2 years, I reported on this huge conflict that had killed about 5 million people since the Rwandan genocide in 1994, which makes it the deadliest conflict since the Second World War. But it wasn't getting a lot of attention. And a lot of my stories we cut down to sort of briefs in a newspaper or maybe something small in a magazine. But in 2004, I shifted to photography. I'd always carried a camera with me and would try to make pictures, but I really started to focus on that. I was actually a Romanian photographer for Reuters at the time who encouraged me based on some of the earlier pictures I'd sent him, Radu Sigeti. Unfortunately, he's not here. He's arriving tomorrow or Sunday. But I went on an assignment to Darfur in Sudan in 2004, and he said, look, we have no pictures from there. Take as many images as you can, send what you want. And what I ended up photographing, unlike my stories that were the 100-word brief in a newspaper, usually on the bottom or the corner of a page that was filled with news from Iraq or Israel or Afghanistan, these pictures ended up running on the front pages of the New York Times, in double-page spreads, in magazines in Europe. And I realized as a form of storytelling, images would have this kind of immediate and emotional impact in a way that I felt my short news dispatches couldn't. And so in Darfur is where I started my photography in 2004. And little by little, I turned to this as a way of telling stories from different parts of the continent as I began to travel around. These pictures are from South Sudan. But then I would go to Somalia. I would cover refugee crises and hunger crises as well. The challenge for me as I was working in these places was not to sort of fall into the trap of cliched images that we see from the various parts of Africa that we know. And we know these pictures of, children with flies in their eyes and all these kind of pictures that don't strike me as very dignified. I would never take those kinds of pictures, let alone file them. So my challenge was really to kind of capture and show the strength of character and the resilience that was involved for people living in these kinds of situations. Yes, they were victims of circumstance, but I never wanted to portray them as victims. I really wanted to try and capture the spirit that always kind of left me feeling pretty humbled by the encounters that I had in these kinds of places. I'd spent 2 years as a reporter in Congo, and it's a conflict that I kept returning to over many years, and try to photograph it in a way that went a little bit deeper than some of the reporting that I felt I was seeing from photographers who would fly in for a couple of days or for a week to try and cover this story. And this involved a lot of photographs of displaced people. I sort of turned to portraiture a lot, but there was this kind of reportage photography as well. But I did lean on portraiture because I felt that in terms of getting closer to things and to stories, I really felt that these kinds of images showed a different kind of side of life there, and this idea that it's not all about men with guns running around, although I do end up photographing that quite a bit too. But I really wanted to get into the civilian aspect of thing and the human side of the stories. I'll come back to this image a little bit later. So yeah, a lot of times I'd be working on portraits, but then there would be things happening. There would be violence. A lot of the conflict happens in very distant places, and it was difficult to get access to the unfolding events, the clashes, the massacres that were often happening in distant parts of the country. Congo is about the size of Western Europe, and it has about 300 kilometers of paved roads. So it's very difficult to get around. But occasionally I would be able to get close to the front lines where fighting was going on. In this sequence, there's government soldiers have captured who they believe is a rebel and are taking him away. I was having a conversation this morning over breakfast about, how do we photograph the dead? Do we photograph them? How do we show it in a way that doesn't feel exploitative? As somebody who's coming to Africa with a white Western gaze, I was always conscious of trying to portray things in a way that didn't feel exploitative to me. And the important thing as a photographer is you want to engage the people who are looking at your pictures. You want them to learn you want them to want to learn more about the story. The idea is not to kind of make them turn away in disgust from an image. So there may be something slightly perverse about trying to create an artfully composed image of violence or of suffering, but that was something that I felt was important to try and do to convey the reality that I was seeing on the ground. I would photograph a lot of situations that I would find recurring over and over. So clashes and violence escalating in certain situations. These are opposition protests against the government in Congo, and the Presidential Guard will just open fire on the protesters with live rounds. So while covering those kinds of unfolding events, I did really feel it was important to try and show a more nuanced and balanced view, because these are the kind of things that will make headlines. These are the kind of images that my editors and bosses and the media will often expect to see from these kinds of places. So it was very important for me to try and balance that and show that in the shadow of these conflicts, life goes on. There's a lot happening. I did a series in Congo of women's traditional hairstyles, just to show that even in the shadow of these wars, there's still an attempt for glamour, for just continuing with daily life. These are pretty much all photographs of women or girls who have been displaced from their homes due to fighting. But for them, life goes on. The other thing that was very important, the longer I was working as a photographer in Africa, is that I really wanted to challenge the preconceived notions of the places where I was working. We have these narratives that are repeated, these kinds of headlines that we see all the time. So ahead of the World Cup in South Africa in 2010, I was sent there to do a bunch of feature stories. And the country has one of the highest rates of HIV and AIDS in the world. And if we think of the typical image of the disease, especially in Africa, it's going to be, a hollowed out, wizened face of somebody with rib cage showing, dying in a hospital. And I wanted to go beyond that. I wanted to try and show a different side of the story. So what I discovered is there's a whole middle generation that has died from the disease. And what that means is that has left grandmothers looking after grandchildren. And so I thought this was a much more interesting approach to telling a story like this. So I found a grandmother who was looking after her daughter's children, and her daughter's husband had died. So I did a short little series. I'm a newswire photographer. I'm not spending months on a story. This is one evening and one morning that I spent with this family, just photographing this grandmother who was 67, looking after a handful of children, and trying just to get in very close with them and show the intimate aspect of life. Nobody in these images has HIV or AIDS, but they are still very affected by the disease. The children don't have their parents, and the grandmother has this burden of looking after very young children on her own. Again, as a newswire photographer, sometimes I have to try and sum up a whole story with one image. This is a graveyard where a lot of victims who have died from HIV and AIDS are buried. The other story that I did in South Africa that kind of goes against the accepted narrative is I was looking for stories to do on the society at large. And when we think of South Africa, we think of a wealthy, privileged white minority that has benefited over the decades from apartheid. What's less known is that there's a smaller demographic of very poor white South Africans who are more or less descendants of the Afrikaans population who went there many centuries ago, and actually who apartheid was more or less created to protect, because during the Depression they moved from their farms. This is the 1930s, from the farms to the cities, and the Calvinist purists didn't like the idea of them living side by side with black South Africans, so they created this system where they could have jobs and employment and live in nicer homes. All of that worked very well for them for many years, but now they've found themselves on the wrong side of history, and they don't get much sympathy from the black South African population now, certainly the ruling population, and much of the white South African demographic kind of sees them as kind of poor white trash. So this is a small percentage of the population, but still an interesting part of the story. And I went and I spent a week living with them in their squatter camp and photographing them, kind of trying to get inside their circle of trust, which is the challenge as a photographer. How do you get into these closed societies? And just sort of see how they're living. And it really was just a question of not being judgmental of their views, trying to see the people with this sense of empathy that we've just been hearing about, and opening up to not what they're saying or what they're thinking, but why and how has this reached this point in time. And again, the idea of turning and flipping the cliches that we see from Africa of white European aid workers handing out food to impoverished black Africans wherever you are on the continent. This is kind of something that turns that cliche on its head in the situation. So I was always trying to do these kinds of stories or find these little threads that, like Sarah was just saying, are a little bit different from what everybody else is looking at. This isn't a story that's particularly widely covered in South Africa. When this was published, it went out in a lot of magazines in Europe and in the New York Times, and various other US outlets as well. There was a death of a small child during the week that I was there. So the other thing I would do, those were a little more emotionally exhausting to be engaged for days and days with subjects. This idea of walking in their shoes, living with them for a week in this squatter camp. But the other thing I would do, I was based in Dakar in Senegal in West Africa for 8 years, and it was very much about showing the fullness of life in a lot of the places where I was working. So I would photograph fashion weeks and show an entirely different side of life than would generally be seen coming from this region. And it was always fascinating to me to see how these pictures would get picked up and used by publications in this kind of way where people are like, wow, that's happening there, really? And of course this is happening. This is happening in many countries in West Africa, in Nigeria. It's happening in South Africa, in Kenya, in South Sudan, and all of these places, but we don't see it. I was in the fortunate position of having the freedom to do these kinds of stories, working for Newswire. I didn't have to try and sell an editor on anything. I was more or less self-assigning. I could just go and put these pictures out, and I knew they would get used by the clients who subscribe to the Reuters news service. So these are the things that I would try to do between the more difficult and emotionally challenging assignments, but more often than not, I would find myself back in another conflict zone, photographing more extreme situations. These are taken in Ivory Coast. And as I covered more of these kinds of civil conflicts and clashes in different countries in West Africa, I kind of moved on a little bit as well and started working in Afghanistan. I first went there because I was interested in what Canadian troops were doing there. This is an Afghan soldier, but I went and I started going in on these embeds with Canadian soldiers who were very much the front of the fighting force in 2007. And a lot of the focus was on Iraq at that time, the American presence in Iraq. But I was really curious what Canadian forces. Canadians we consider ourselves peacekeepers. One of our prime ministers came up with the idea of UN peacekeeping. So the fact that Canadians were now in combat for the first time since the Korean War was fascinating to me, and I wanted to go there and see what was happening, and ended up getting very close to these stories, and to the kind of violence that you're seeing in these pictures, very far removed from the third country nationals who are serving the food at the bigger bases where these guys would deploy from. I would look for the quieter moments too, amid the violence. On the patrols that I would spend hours and hours out on, when things weren't happening, I did a series on doors just to kind of have something that was changing the pace. This was at the time of the Arab Spring. The news wires and newspapers were flooded with violent imagery, people protesting, people fighting, people getting injured. So I just wanted to show something a little bit more quiet, reflective. For me, I think on some level as well, that these closed doors were a symbol of my own frustration with not being able to get outside the military sphere in my reporting as an embedded photographer, and also kind of suggested this idea that the foreign presence there was not really welcome. I moved on next to Libya and covered the war there in 2011 as Gaddafi was knocked from power. I would run up and down the front line with the rebels from the east, taking these kinds of pictures, which they're not that interesting, they're not that valuable, but they're taken at great risk. But they're pretty disposable, really. I don't think they have a whole lot of lasting power beyond the images for that day. But the level of risk involved in getting these images is, I was starting to think, what's really the risk to return ratio here? And I would kind of think about other ways to photograph these stories. And like I did with the doors in Afghanistan, there was this road that we would travel up and down, Revolution Road, basically. So I decided to do a series of still lifes along the road. This is one of the few stories that I worked on where there were a lot of journalists covering this story. Most of the places where I worked, I was usually just on my own, or maybe a few other journalists around. One of the pictures I took while I was there was of my friend Tim Hetherington, a photographer who had done amazing work in Afghanistan and in Sierra Leone and Liberia. This would be his last assignment, because a few days after this picture was taken, a mortar hit a position where he was in Libya, and he and another friend, Chris Hondros, a very well-known photographer, were both killed. This was something that really shook our community of photographers, especially the smaller kind of tribe of war photographers who do this kind of work. And at that point, I'd already begun to kind of question the work that I was doing, this idea that I was having this kind of lifestyle and career that was going well, but people like this man here in Congo, his name is Boniface Buhoro, and that's his little son, 3-year-old Sidiki. I took this picture in Congo in a camp for displaced as gunfire erupted between government troops and rebels, and I ended up snapping this quick picture of him before I kind of hunkered down with him. And we spent the next 45 minutes with our legs intertwined as the shooting went on around us, and I could feel Sidiki's heartbeat throughout this whole thing, and we just sort of talked in quiet whispers, and I kind of interviewed him and did a whole I recorded it, and it was kind of my way of dealing with this situation while we were very close in this situation. And I would go back, and a couple of years later, I would photograph Boniface again, still in the same camp. His situation hadn't improved. Same with this man, Jean-Claude Benda. He had been shot in the leg during clashes in the town, where a rebel group came in and shot all the fighting-age men in the village so that they would never be able to rise up and fight them. And I would go back a year or two later, I think this was 2 years later, and there he was still, kind of struggling to do anything. So I started to feel like my photographs weren't, really benefiting the people who were in my images. Come back to this one here. This is the image that I won the World Press Photo of the Year award in 2006. That's the biggest award in photojournalism, the most prestigious one. And I don't say that as a boast. I say that more kind of out of shame in a way, because in 1975, my picture was taken in Niger during a hunger crisis, kind of annual hunger crisis, due to the seasonal shifts in food production. But in 1975, almost exactly 30 years earlier, there was a photograph taken by Olav Carter, a photographer for the Chicago Tribune, in Niger, in the same area of Niger where I took my image. So 30 years apart, 2 images, winning the main prize in photojournalism, but nothing had really changed. A year later, a German photographer went back and actually photographed Fatou Husseini, the woman in the image, and Alassa Galisu, the small boy, and found them roaming with some nomads in the desert. And as you can see in the image, she's still wearing the same outfit as she was in my picture, but it's now much more faded and by the sun and tattered by the wind. I'm just going to read a little something from the book here. 2 images taken 3 decades apart earn the world's most celebrated photojournalism award by showing the same situation, the same misery, in the same place, in almost exactly the same way. Photographs reflecting history repeated, a hall of mirrors, ricocheting images to infinity without going anywhere. The world appears indifferent to atrocities, abuse, corruption, profound immorality and hardship, or at least is helpless to address them. Journalists and aid workers respond to each crisis as if it were something new, as if our collective efforts might be more than minuscule gestures in the vast cycle of human history and the merry-go-round of disasters. Yet much of the aid world is self-righteous and inefficient and plays a questionable role in perpetuating conflicts by allowing morally bankrupt leaders to indulge their own worst impulses. Not that the media is much better. I feel more and more like the proverbial vulture swooping in to feed on the carrion of the human condition. The longer I spend covering upheaval and our collective response to it, the more cynical I become about the motives of the multinational organizations behind our well-meaning band of misfits. The corporations we work for are ultimately driven by profits. Providing a valuable public service and making a buck are not mutually exclusive, but it's increasingly difficult to photograph the pain and suffering of others and then enjoy the rewards that come with success, however that's measured, recognition from bosses, awards, or even just the benefits of a staff job with a good salary that allows me to live in a 4-bedroom villa by the sea with a housekeeper who cooks and cleans and a watchman who guards my home. It's this disparity I find hard to reconcile. By some cosmic twist, I've ended up living comfortably on one side of the lens because of misery and want residing on the other. If all my efforts and sacrifices aren't making any difference, then what's the point? Is our profession more driven by ego, winning awards and recognition, than by some genuine desire to do good? Should I accept this fact and focus on the job? Or would it make more sense, and be more honest, to leave all this behind and become a wedding or fashion photographer? That would raise some eyebrows. These are my thoughts on a good day. Bad days are another story. So at this point, my cup is filling up, and I'm starting to feel like I come back from these stories and these assignments, and I've kind of felt emotionally exhausted by them, and I feel numb. It's harder and harder for me to relate to my friends, my family, my girlfriend at home, and I feel very distant and removed. And so what I end up doing is I keep going back to these kinds of situations because that's the only way that I can kind of sort of feel anything. So after Chris and Tim are killed, I actually take a year off. I take a sabbatical year, and I spend it studying psychology and learning more about trauma. And after my year, I think I'll go back, I'll be more prepared. But when I return, Reuters decides that they want to move me out of West Africa, and they send me instead to Israel, where I'm going to be based. Initially, I think maybe this will be okay. Maybe it'll be an easier place to live. I won't have some of the sort of logistical challenges and hardships that involve that I spent 12 years dealing with as a journalist in West Africa. Didn't work out like that. I ended up covering the Gaza War in 2014, and it was the most violent and lopsided war that I had ever seen. And these were the kinds of images that I was producing there. Every morning I'd get up, drive around, see what just buildings had been bombed overnight, photograph the dead at the morgue and the grieving families, the funerals, the shock, the despair. And I became part of this media circus surrounding this kind of work. And for me, this was a tipping point. I knew at this stage that something was wrong. I couldn't do this anymore. And I'll just read another part from this book. For all the conflict I've covered, I've never seen industrial killing on such a scale, nor witnessed the kind of collective glorification and documentation of death. It introduces a strange new level of torment. Every day in Gaza's morgues, I elbow my way through crowds of mourners and photographers, step through pools of blood, and take pictures of mutilated bodies and piles of corpses. Anywhere else, such behavior would be absurd, unconscionable even, but here it's part of the war routine. I struggle to reconcile my own behavior with the lack of dignity accorded the dead. Then, after a while, I realize it's actually kind of a ritual. It's part of the mourning process. Such rituals help people cope with the immensity of the tragedy consuming them. And perhaps we would all evoke such rituals of our own if confronted with such grief. One afternoon, I'm inside a morgue during a relative lull. There are only a few other people inside the room when a worker opens a drawer containing the bodies of 3 children. Their bright clothes are covered in that gray cinder-block dust of Gaza, their hair tousled and their limbs intertwined, as if they passed out together on a sleepover. It's nothing I haven't seen and photographed a dozen times already, but for some reason, perhaps the relative quiet at that moment, the scene freezes me. I can't photograph. I'm overcome by a physical wave of sadness. I can hardly breathe. There's a weight on my chest, and I feel the prickle of hot tears. I leave the gloom of the morgue and step out into the bright afternoon sun. I no longer want any part in this ritual. The media is one of the most powerful weapons in a war where the Palestinians are outgunned on the battlefield. The staggering number of civilian deaths, especially of women and children, is used by the Palestinians to convey the message that Israel is slaughtering innocents on a massive scale. That much is true, but the propaganda machines and lobby groups on both sides of the conflict are working around the clock to get their version of the story heard. It's a cynical game with civilians trapped in the middle. Photography for me has always been about illustrating the common threads connecting disparate lives with a view to building empathy and understanding. But the only common thread here seems to be a mutual hatred and the lust for destruction of the other. By contributing to the steady flow of images from the war, I feel somehow complicit in perpetuating the endless spectacle of violence. With mass media amplifying and even romanticizing the very thing we seek to condemn, it's as if we're not here to capture an image, but rather to maintain one. So the Gaza War ends. I return to my office in Israel, and a couple of weeks later, I'm called into an office and told that I'm being laid off. The company is downsizing because the photography industry is contracting. They need to save money, and I was expensive. It's cheaper to use some local photographers. So suddenly, I no longer have a job. But I'm going to backtrack here for a minute, because a couple of years earlier, I'd met this guy, Sergeant Thomas James Brennan. And I'll just play this short video on how we met and what the situation was, where we first encountered each other.
Gunshot wound in the right leg. There is an entry and exit wound with a tourniquet on his right leg. Break.
Decorez, this is Kunjak. Are you copying the transmissions from the CP?
I looked back and I saw the warhead. It was coming straight towards Chun and I. I told Chun to get down. We both hit the deck. I don't remember the boom. All I remember is after the smoke had cleared, I saw Staff Sergeant Gonzalez running towards us, screaming my name. My name is Thomas Brennan. I'm a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I'm with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, Alpha Company, and I'm the squad leader for 3rd Platoon, 4th Squad. The objective was to push up approximately 4,000 meters to a target building to potentially ambush the Taliban. But we left OP Kunjak at about 1,300. We pushed down into the city in a book. Once we got down there, we probably patrolled in about 400 or 500 meters, and that's when we started taking pretty heavy volumes of fire.
Hey, we're moving! What? They're moving! I'm moving!
We wound up maneuvering on them. We made it about another 75 meters down the road where we hit an open field, and that's where we started taking AK and RPK fire. We set up shop inside a compound. We had the security out there. We had the AMP with the RPK, and I had a saw gunner out there, and I had one of my team leaders out there with the 203 providing suppression. I had Lance Corporal Roche and Lance Corporal Orr moved to the next alleyway to set up our next mounting position, and that's when they got hit with an RPG. We thought they stepped on a pressure plate and got blown up by an IED at first, but then we seen them running back. They were pretty dazed. They suffered grade 2 concussions. We had the corpsman set them inside the compound, take a look at the two of them, and that's when myself and Lance Corporal Chun, we ran up to the same alleyway. That's when him and I got knocked out by an RPG that the AMP shot. It hit the telephone pole right next to me. Him and I both suffered 3rd grade concussions. My head really started hurting. I started having trouble seeing. My eyes hurt like hell. I kind of sounded dumber than I used to be because words weren't making sense in my head. But after about 2 days, my eyes started getting back to normal. I could start to focus, trying to piece it all together, but it's all kind of blurry. My squad watched 4 people get hurt. My team leaders still kept doing their job. My junior Marines still kept doing their job. And even the guys that got hurt by the concussions, we were still trying to the best of our ability to do our job. I'm just really proud of my guys, and I can't wait to get back to them and let them know. It's kind of hard to explain. We came together, family sticks together, and as long as I'm good to be out there, I want to be out there with them.
Oh, that goes on, but I'll stop it there. So when TJ returned from his deployment, he was found to have this traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress from a previous deployment in Iraq. And he too was ushered out of the military for medical reasons. So he had to find, he'd as well been kind of cut off from this brotherhood of Marines that he had known all his life or all his adult life and been part of. So he had to kind of redefine himself and find out what he was going to do in a civilian world. And one of the things he started by doing was writing a letter to me based on our kind of friendship. And the letter, I didn't know about it, but he had colluded with some New York Times editors who I'd cooperated with when I'd written stories about him and my time together with him. He wrote this piece about what it was like to be on the other side of my camera. And even though we'd kept in touch sporadically, this kind of re-sparked a dialogue between us. And we started talking more, and he began sending me more detailed kind of written stories about his struggles. And they were really interesting. And I thought, look, if you want to do something with these beyond as a way to process your own experiences, then I can help you with this. I can put you in touch. I can help you write them, and kind of we did a sort of a media boot camp in a way where I mentored him into journalism, and he wrote this year-long series for the New York Times at War blog about the various issues he was dealing with, getting help from the Veterans Affairs Department, and what it was like the first time he killed in Iraq. And this is one of the things that we talk about in the book, is how his experience as a combatant is very different from mine as a professional witness. He had to kill people. He killed children by accident in combat. That's a very different moral weight for him to carry than the kind of moral conundrums that I was faced with. He tried to commit suicide. These are all things that he decided to speak about openly. And through these articles and through the process of working with him on them, we came up with the idea of working on a book together. And for me, I had become very disillusioned and very depressed about, before I even left Reuters, with the idea of my work not having an impact and the idea that it all seemed pretty futile, really. And then this feeling of alienation and isolation when I no longer had a job. And so what I did is I turned to TJ, because he had already been through this. He'd lost his position in the Marines. He had to recast himself and find a new identity away from the front lines. And so working with him actually helped me, because I could see the impact that it was having on him. And at a certain point, when he left, he got a job with his local newspaper reporting on the military. He applied for an online journalism degree, which he got. He applied to Columbia, the top journalism school in the US, for their graduate program, was accepted there into their investigative unit, where he spent a year getting his master's in journalism. He then came out of school and decided he wanted to keep writing about the military. But there was nowhere to really do that. The New York Times had closed down its At War blog because the wars were kind of spiraling and winding down. So he launched a Kickstarter campaign, raised $50,000 to start his own news website, digital newsroom, covering the military. And within a year, he broke this massive story that went across all the national media and internationally about a closed Facebook group where members of the military were sharing photographs of naked female Marines and stolen pictures and revenge porn stuff. And this had a massive impact. It was front page New York Times, and that's him there. Was on all the media in the US, internationally, big stories in magazines. And it just went on, led to congressional and Pentagon inquiries that changed the codes of conduct across the armed forces around the world in terms of online harassment, and went basically straight to the top of the administration. It had an impact on him as well. He was seen by this brotherhood that he had been part of for so long as a traitor. Not all of them, but the ones who were involved with this. He received death threats. He received bounties on his wife and his daughter, and threats that they should be raped and killed. This kind of thing was what he had to deal with. But he had found an area where he could work, and a space within journalism through the sort of entrepreneurship, and the Warhorse is now being studied at Harvard as a kind of case study. But through all of this, we were working on the book. Through my time in Israel and Gaza, we were collaborating on the idea of the book and having this understanding where we wanted to write something about our experiences to try and make sense of them, first to ourselves, but also to from my part of the book, members of the media who cover this kind of thing, to be able to have the conversation where we talk about the emotional impact of the work we do. For him to kind of, address the stigma in the military about asking for mental health care, And the book is about war, but it's also really, as the subtitle suggests, our journey back. How do we recreate new identities away from the front lines? How do we bring our moral center back to a place that we feel comfortable with ourselves and the things we've done, and the differences in what that means for each of us? Our experiences are different. Somebody last night was saying to me at a table, "Oh, I've been to Ukraine, I've covered conflict, but I've never been shot at like you have. So my experience isn't as traumatic." And I would warn against comparing experiences, because whatever our experience, somebody else's is worse. One of the things that I found working in these places where I worked is that I felt bad, feeling bad, because my experience was not as desperate as the situation of the people who I was photographing. And so I would feel guilty about feeling crappy. And what right do I have to feel bad or sorry for myself? I have a good home, I have a salary, I have some sense of security that the people I'm photographing don't. So comparing these experiences is not particularly helpful. Everybody's experience is valid to themselves. And so really the book is about friendship and how I leaned on him and he leaned on me, and how we kind of helped each other through these very difficult and challenging times to kind of come out the other side, and then share our story in the book about how we did that, what worked and what the challenges were. And one of the things I would say really is that it was all about re-engaging first with each other and then the world around us, the people we cared about. Because, as I mentioned before, coming back from these places, when you're feeling traumatized, the instinct is to withdraw and retreat into yourself, into the shadows, and not sort of put yourself out into the world that can be quite difficult and challenging when you're feeling very raw. But we needed to engage. I had to engage with him. He had to re-engage with his wife and daughter, and me with my family. And so that's what the book is about. That's what we're exploring in it, and to kind of keep this idea going. And now we both have these lives away from war, away from the kind of things that we actively engaged with for a number of years. And so now, in conclusion, what I do is, I try to get into nature, and I do the kinds of things. This is my new obsession. I cycle like 200 miles a week, 300 kilometers a week on my bike. That's my meditation, my mindful activity that allows me to kind of be in the moment. Because when you're traumatized, you tend to you ruminate on the past, or you get anxious about the future, and this kind of roots me in the moment. And this is one way of re-engaging with my own story. So, thank you.